History, a premier and paramount priority for progress of a people, arguably the single most important cultural property. It is the great unifier of all societies, from classical to contemporary. It is the shining beacon that restores vision to the blind. It is imperative that we create a unified effort to learn from it, that we may emulate its successes and prevent repeating its mistakes. For without history, we are without purpose. We are without identity. Welcome to the gray area, where we examine history in hindsight. January 15th, 1535, Henry VIII declares himself head of the church in England, superseding the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. 1759, British Museum opens in Montague House, London. One of their first exhibits was Egyptian. 1844, University of Notre Dame receives its first charter in Indiana. 1908, Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, first Greek letter organization established by African American women. 1915, Japan claims economic control over China. 1919, 2 million gallons of molasses flood Boston, Massachusetts in the Great Molasses Flood when a storage container burst, drowning 21 and injuring 150. 1929, Martin Luther King Jr., an African American civil rights activist who is best known for using nonviolent civil disobedience to secure equal rights for African Americans, was born. 1942, the Chicago Cubs dropped plans to install lights at Wrigley Field. Why? Because of the military's need for materials. It would take 35 years before the lights were finally installed. 1943, world's largest office building, the Pentagon, is completed to house the U.S. military. It required over 1,000 workers to complete the air conditioning system alone. 1945, the Manhattan Project's G5 group, headed by a physicist, Donald Kirst and Seth Niedermeyer, take their first Betatron pictures of a nuclear implosion at the Los Alamos Laboratory. 1950, over 4,000 attend National Emergency Civil Rights Conference in Washington, D.C. 1955, the first solar-heated, radiation-cooled house was built by Raymond Bliss in Tucson, Arizona. 1967, the first National Football League's Super Bowl was played. It was the Green Bay Packers who defeated the Kansas City Chiefs of the American Football League. The final score, 35-10. 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed a legislation making Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a national holiday. 2009, Roland Wallace Burris was sworn in as the U.S. Senator from Illinois. Burris's appointment made him the third African-American U.S. Senator from the state of Illinois and the sixth Black U.S. Senator in the history of the United States. But rewinding all the way back to 1846, Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky, his first novel, Poor Folk, is published in the St. Petersburg Collection Almanac. The story is centered around primarily two characters, Varvara Dobrosolova and Makar Devushkin, who are actually second cousins twice removed and lived across the street from each other on the same street in desperate and slum conditions. Devushkin lives with several other tenants, such as the Gorshkovs, whose son groans in agonizing pain from hunger every night throughout the entire story, which becomes an annoyance for Devushkin, which he's incapable of doing anything about. And the Devushkin's portion of the apartment is a sectioned off kitchen where he sleeps in a corner on the floor. Devushkin and Dobrosolova exchange letters attesting to their heinous living conditions, and Devushkin tries to impress her by frequently squandering his money on gifts to impress her. While Dobrosolova originally lived in the country but moved to St. Petersburg, which she grows to detest, when her father lost his job. Her father becomes very violent, and her mother begins suffering from severe depression. Her father dies, and they move in with a lady named Anna Fyodorovna, a rude and obnoxiously cruel landlady that pretends to feel sympathy for their situation, but looks at them as suckers to be abused because her place is the only thing she knows they can afford. Dobrosolova is tutored by a poor student named Pokrovsky, whom she takes a liking to, but also whose drunken father occasionally visits. She eventually falls in love with Pokrovsky, and she struggles to save a measly amount of money to purchase a gift for Pokrovsky's birthday, then allows his father to give him the gift, claiming that just knowing he received the gift will be enough for her happiness. So Devushkin tries to impress her by frequently giving her gifts that he cannot afford, and she in turn tries to impress Pokrovsky by expressing her love by buying him gifts. However, Pokrovsky falls ill soon after, and in his dying wish was only to see the sun and the world outside. Dobrosolova obliges by opening the blinds to reveal gray clouds and dirty rain, at which point Pokrovsky only shakes his head in discontent and disgust as he passes away. Dobrosolova's mother dies shortly thereafter, and Dobrosolova is left in the care of Anna, the landlady, for a period of time. But the abuse comes to a critical nexus where she thought it was too much, and she goes to live with a neighbor named Fedora across the street. While Devushkin works as a lowly but hard-working copyist, frequently belittled and picked on by his colleagues. His clothing is worn and dirty, and his living conditions are perhaps even worse than Dobrosolova's. He considers himself a rat in society. In contrast, by today's measure, Devushkin would be considered an incel. However, he and Dobrosolova begin exchanging letters, and eventually they also begin to exchange books. Devushkin becomes offended when she sends him a copy of The Overcoat because he finds the main character is living a life similar to his own. Dobrosolova considers moving to another part of the city where she can work as a governess. However, just as he is out of money and risks being evicted, Devushkin has a stroke of luck. His boss begins to take pity on him, recognizing that he has been underappreciated, gives him 100 rubles to buy new clothes. Devushkin pays off his debts and sends some to Dobrosolova. However, she sends him 25 of the rubles back because she says she does not need it. The Gorshkovs, who are Devushkin's roommates, come into money, and the future looks bright for the both of them because he can now start to save money, and it may be possible for them to move in together, or at least Devushkin hopes so, now that it looks like his roommates are leaving with the newly found money they came into. However, the Gorshkov's father dies, leaving the family in shambles, despite the money, meaning they must now stay at the apartment with Devushkin. Dobrosolova, on the other hand, announces that a rich man by the name of Mr. Bykov, who had dealings with the landlady Anna Fyodorovna and Pokrovsky's father, who's the father of her love interest, has proposed to her. She decides to leave with him, and the last few letters to Devushkin attest to her slowly becoming accustomed to her new money. She asks Devushkin to find linen for her and begins to talk about the various luxuries but leaves him alone in the end, despite his improving fortunes. In the last correspondence in the story, Devushkin begs Dobrosolova to write to him. Dobrosolova responds, saying that all is over, but do not forget me. The last letter from Devushkin tells her that he loves her and that without her, he would die. Now, it is a sad but foreboding story, and it parallels contemporary society's relationship dynamic. You see, Dostoevsky lived under one of Russia's most oppressive rulers, Nicholas I, who manufactured poverty to expand serfdom. His reasons? To prevent the aristocracy from growing too big to challenge his rule. In modern contrast, in America, the comparison would be the ever-eroding middle class. Finance and economics are at the heart of all relationships, whether business or personal. And the modern sentiment is the idea that nice guys finish last, mostly due to the moral failings of women. However, that has never been true. Nice guys finish last mostly because they're broke and for no other reason. In the black community, for example, there is this idea that women choose the lowest quality men due to some kind of imagined moral failing as well. However, that is also false. The reality is that black men making these falsely derived statements are men of low quality, likely even lower quality than the so-called men they claim black women are choosing. And when a woman has to choose between men of equal quality or financial status, it has always been and stood throughout history that they will choose the man more appealing to the eye. This is why in psychology, this type of delusional thinking is referred to as projection, because it is an acknowledgement that the competing male has something more valuable or is perceived as more valuable than the very men making the claim. Nice guys finished last in 2019 for the same reason Devushkin finished last in Dostoevsky's story of 1846, and it will be the same reason they finished last in 2020. And it is because they are broke, not because they are nice. It is because they have the moral failing. And what is that moral failing? The moral failing is the failure to create a better economy or be politically inclined to try to change the overall economic situation so that men, specifically black men, can have a chance to thrive, so that they do not end up following the same tragic life stories of Devushkin. You see, history, much like time, waits for no man. It is ultimately up to us to decide whether we choose to make it or be the reason we repeat it. However, no matter what side of it that you stand on, you can only learn from it by looking at history in hindsight.